Hey everyone, my name is Francisco. This is Latin Entertainment, and welcome to Conversamos. Today's episode is on the Abrahamic religions and Latinidad. Join us as we share a critical view of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam with the relation to various Latine perspectives. We hope you enjoy this episode of Conversamos.
Yeah, yo, is it that wrong? I'm making a song, I'm taking it back for the platform that I formed. Music's helping me transform. I run the reservoir, the predator.
So personally, let's see. Okay, aside from the whole concept of me coming into contact with Islam was when I met my stepfather. And he would try as best he could to teach me, but I feel like that maybe wasn't enough. So I went out of my way and I asked him, can you take me to a mosque, which is a place of worship for Muslims? And so I started asking questions because you can't really, I feel like what I've learned a lot is you're not going to learn without asking. So I asked. And also even when I felt confused, we have our friend Google. So I started researching other things because then I found out, there's different sects of Islam. Maybe am I missing something? I want to get as much knowledge as I can. And obviously I also started reading on my own the Spanish translation of a Quran, so I could get even more rather than from hearsay from people's mouths. I wanted to look directly at the source of Islam that we were given to look at. So I felt like for me to supplement my own knowledge, I researched a lot. I talked to lots of people. And back when I reverted, I didn't even know there was other Hispanic Muslims. Like, the community was very small. And then finally, when I joined social media, I had a lot of Latino Muslims reach out to me, and I had an even bigger resource to talk to them about this religion from somebody who comes from the same background, because I am Mexican. I can't really relate to a lot of life matters as I would with the Arab who was born into the religion, if that makes sense. So yeah, just lots of research, because I'm a very scientific method type of person where I need logic, to really understand something. So
For me,
yes.
I mentioned going to faith formation Sunday school type thing. And then I was a youth group kid, so my mom helped out with youth group and stuff like that. And but it wasn't until I went to college. So I also am a public school kid. So I feel like that's almost an anomaly when it comes to Catholic kids. Like a lot of times it's Catholic school, ride or die, and that's it. But I am a product of public school, which I'm totally okay with and totally proud of. So I went to Indiana University, which is a Big Ten school in Indiana. And there is a Catholic student center there. And I, just went because that's what a good Catholic does, on Sunday Mass. So I was there at Sunday Mass, and thank goodness I had a really good friend from Northwest Indiana who I knew was super, was raised in the Catholic Church, super Catholic, came from a super Catholic family, that kind of thing. And so we were kind of hey, let's be Mass buddies, let's go to church together and hold each other accountable to at least going every Sunday. So we would, and eventually we got a hold of the whole Catholic student community. And it wasn't until probably my sophomore year of college that I really started asking deeper questions, and seeking the answers instead of just regurgitating things that had been taught to me, if that makes sense. I was completely content doing that, and I was completely okay with it, until I just, wasn't anymore. And I was I want to know more about, my religion, more about my church, more about, the people inside of it. And so
I think for me, when I was a kid, I was so inquisitive. It continued to be so inquisitive. I continued to ask a lot of questions. And I was that kid in Sunday school that would always, the teacher would say something and I would have a comeback or a question to ask. And I think really early on, my parents saw that, and they fostered the kind of the ability for me to ask questions growing up from a really young age. And I think because they gave me space to ask questions and to experience doubt, and not making me feel like just because it seemed like I was experiencing some doubt that meant that I didn't have faith, and helping me to understand that the opposite of faith isn't doubt. And I think at home, having them really help me walk through that process, and having them always creating space for me to ask questions, I think at a kind of during my teenage years was really formative, because when I did go off to college, I was able to own my faith for myself, and be able to like have that really strong foundation. And I think the other thing, just making sure that I was always connected to community, and connected with other people that I could also have conversations with. And so I think, Tori, you talk about like safe spaces. And so I think for me, it's always been really important to have those safe spaces, either with my family, friends, and then also having that feeling like I have a safe space with God to express questions and to express doubt. So I after college, after I did my undergrad at the University of Central Florida, so I grew up in Florida, and then I moved to Boston to come to law school at Northeastern. And law school was like a prime place for me to continue to kind of experience doubt and wrestle with doubt. But I think one of the things about law school is that it really shapes your mind to be critical, and to think about how can you deconstruct arguments and then reconstruct arguments. And I actually have been able to apply a lot of those kind of skill sets, I guess you could say, to the text of Scripture. And so that has been just other ways that I can continue to kind of discern in my own relationship with God. But it always comes through a lot of questioning, and always playing that kind of, I was a lawyer from a very young age before I was actually a lawyer. So
I guess my own understanding of my own religion. So I grew up, but like I said, my dad didn't become more religious until later in life. And it was definitely at my mom's, like my mom led the way in that, because she grew up with, her Jewish family, and however small it was, a Jewish community in Lima in Peru. And so there was never a part of me that didn't feel like it was important, like Judaism wasn't important in my life, or rather, there was never a part of me that didn't feel that it was important. But as I got older, I did start to question more of the theological aspect. So I think the first time I really questioned it was when I was in high school. My boyfriend asked me if I believe in God, and he said that I didn't, and I was like, what? How? Why? But then I went to Florida State for a little while, Florida State University, go Noles. And that's where I took a class on Judaism and like the history of it, and learned a lot more about like halakha, about like Jewish law and the Talmud, and customs that are outdated, and also customs that have influenced, or like interpretation of the Torah that has influenced the way that more observant Jews now behave. And that's when I really started questioning, like, well, that's why we do this. Well, that seemed like it could have been relevant 5,000 years ago. Not so much right now. Like that doesn't feel like that specific custom or law is something for my life. But like, for my dad, it was devastating. And he was like, I put you in Hebrew school, I do this, and I take you to shul, and how did this happen? And I was like, well, that's kind of how. And Judaism does encourage you like to question and to think. And I think that's a really important part of it. And, my brother and I started getting more into like science and physics, and we watched a lot of like Stephen Hawking specials. And the more we learned about the universe, the more I started to think, well, this is, there's so much that we seem to know empirically and truthfully that conflicts with what has to do with faith. And I decided to go for evidence, but at the same time, I think it's so important to like celebrate the Jewish holidays and acknowledge where you came from, and maintain your traditions and your community, because at the end of the day, no matter what you believe, somebody's going to look at you and tell you you're a Jew, whether it's in a good way or a bad way. And that's why I think it's just we've gone through so much just like persecution and genocide because of who we inherently are, that I think it's important for us to have strength in that and community in that, and embrace it as much as we can.
For me, I think I never really had like a moment where I wanted to become more religious, because my father's family is they're secular Jews, and my mother, even though she's Catholic, she didn't. It wasn't like that. Neither of them were extremely religious, and on the Jewish side, especially coming from Poland, there is a way of looking at religion, because a lot of times for Jewish people, when you talk about a lot of religion, it comes down to being Hasidic, and my father's family really was sort of anti-Hasidic, and so I never really wanted to become more religious, because even as a young person, as a young adult, I equated being more religious with dressing a certain way, with being outside of what I considered to be modern. And so what did happen for me was that I worked at a Catholic school, and even though I grew up with my mother being Catholic, it kind of made me realize that I did believe in my heart Jewish things and Jewish concepts of like how the world worked, and it kind of gave me a respect for the fact that other religions had similar beliefs but conceptualized them in a different way, and so I became more interested in reading about how the religions were more similar, and how they had the same tenets a lot of the times, but had different ways of conceptualizing them. And I think if I hadn't gone to work at a Catholic school, I wouldn't have realized that this is really fundamentally what I believe, and it wouldn't have made me look at a lot of different religions and see what the commonalities are. And I really appreciate that part of my teaching experience and what it brought and how it enriched my Judaism.
And part of especially my encounter with Catholicism, growing up with it, was actually looking at it through a Jewish lens for quite a bit of time, actually. And that eventually led me to go to the seminary. I went to a Catholic seminary, and part of going to the Catholic seminary was to work out whatever it was that I was searching for and trying to get a deeper understanding of faith. And I went there, and I went there with that background and also with a very twisted understanding of the world. I had this belief that the world was about to come to an end and so on and so forth. So going to the seminary was helpful psychologically, and it was also a time when, I began to feel that it was safe to really study other religions outside of the Christianity and Judaism and so on and so forth. And so I started to look at other religious traditions like Buddhism and so on and so forth. I'm also of a Puerto Rican background, so from a young age we were aware that we have indigenous roots. So I used to study, some of the Taino religion when I was young, and that was always in the back of my mind, the Native American traditions and so on and so forth. So there was this kind of openness there, but there was also always like this question of, well, how you work out this fact that religious people dominate each other and so on and so forth. That's not too religious. So that took me to like the social justice side of things for a while, and I had to reconcile that with what that means with religiosity. And eventually I stopped my studies at the seminary, and I ended up leaving for a while. I went to I was living at the seminary. I ended up moving to my university dorm, and I was in this crisis period for a bit. And then I eventually started to explore Islam, which I had been exposed to in Philadelphia, because I grew up in the Philadelphia area. And then after some time, I ended up going to Egypt to study, to try to get a better understanding of Islam, because a lot of what I was exposed to was very shallow. And so I stayed in Egypt for like 5 years to study Islam. And then now actually I'm a director of a religious program in the Chicagoland area. And so, you know, my experience has been that it's necessary to just explore, have an academic side, theoretical side, and then at the end of the day, we have to figure out how we're going to live with each other. That's been my
Nice, thank you. And a commonality I see with everyone is you mentioned your own like ethnicity, nationality. So to really expand on that type of conversation, how have you balanced your religion with your Latinidad, or how has your relationship been between your religion and your race or ethnicity, or again Latinidad?
right. But I think that that question really has a lot to do with you on a personal level, and it has a lot to do with you understanding your own history and understanding your own people, and then understanding that religious orientation that you're coming from, right? And to see where there's an overlap and where there's boundaries, because sometimes we study religion, whatever religion it may be, and sometimes really part of what we're studying in the religion is culture, and it's not the principles or the values of the religion, and we mix those things up, right? So some of us that go outside of, for instance, being, you know, the Latino, so to speak, or Latinx, or however you want to say it, sometimes we don't work that out with ourselves, you know, and we have to struggle that out, because there's a lot to that. There's a food issue, you know, your food begins to change. Like, you know, for me, the pork thing goes out the door, and, you know, there's adjustments that you make, and there's customs. Like, okay, for instance, is our culture, like in Puerto Rican culture, is our culture just party? You know, is it just drinking, or is there something more? So you have to kind of figure out what's going on in your own culture, and seeing where you stand on certain things. And then you start to begin to see overlaps, and then you kind of feel comfortable once again. It's like, I think probably the best metaphor, and it comes from another religion, is that, you know, at the beginning of my journey, mountains were not mountains, and then at the end of the journey, you know, mountains are mountains. And that I think that at the beginning of the journey, you're uncomfortable with yourself. And then towards the end of your journey, when you start maturing, you kind of learn how to be comfortable with yourself and your community.
Thank you. Zul?
Yeah, I'm kind of want to bounce off of Yusuf's concept of mountains not being mountains till later, because when I reverted, I was very young. I was 11 years old, and things were simpler back then, because it didn't seem hard, because I already came with a religious background, and the community around me was so religious. But then as I grew up, I moved out of the place I was. I came into contact with more of my Latino family, and they introduced me to bailes, to parties, quinceañeras, and drinking and stuff. And I've never drank, but there's been a lot of opportunity. So then I started realizing, wow, I'm becoming more confused with my identity than I was before. Before I thought, oh, I'm just a Christian girl. But now I have rules to follow. I have put more depth into how I carry myself now with identifying as a Muslim. So there's obviously, I can't drink, I can't eat pork. And then it would come into conflict with my life of how I wanted to live, it would go, before it would be just, I'm just going to a quinceañera with my family. But now it's even more than that. Am I going to go dance? Have people trying to ask me to dance with them, or, well, take a sip of this. And it goes a lot more into that. And then once I explain to them, they're confused. They're like, why? And so I have to explain to them I'm this way. So after having to explain myself so many times, I feel like I lost myself, because people would then start telling me things like, oh, you're not Mexican, you might as well be Arab, or something like that. So then I started being confused, because I'm now growing up in a house split between Arabs and Mexicans, because now I'm growing up culturally as an Arab, but I still don't want to lose myself as a Mexican.
So I am also Mexican, and I feel like that's a very common thing to be Mexican and be Catholic. Like I feel like those things are extremely common. I actually grew up in a primarily Caucasian town. I was one of like the very few people of color in like any grade that I was in. And same thing when I went to college. I chose, I think it's like less than 15% are Hispanic at Indiana University. So I was very much still like in my comfort zone though, because that's how I grew up. Like I sometimes would forget like, oh yeah, I am a little bit darker than anybody else in this room. But I didn't start tapping into it. Like my parents still made sure like I still am connected to my roots in the sense that like I danced ballet folklorico growing up, like even though we had to drive 45 minutes to the nearest dance group, that kind of thing. And so once I went to college though, and like I wanted to get more in touch with my roots, I guess, like just having more Latino friends and like, feeling more comfortable, like truly being like my true self and not having to feel like I need to, talk in a specific way or like certain things or whatever. And that's kind of actually like the phase that I'm in right now. Like I'm searching for more of my community. And I feel like that has to do with the fact that I actually work for the Catholic Church. So I am a director for youth and young adult ministry here in Northwest Indiana. So at a cluster of 3 churches, one of which has a very, very large Hispanic population. And like being able to witness like Las Posadas and like novenas and like, doing different things like Dia de los Muertos and stuff like that in church is just so incredibly beautiful. And so I am like able to kind of connect, like my, like not just be culturally Catholic in also like a Mexican sense, but also like be Catholic in a Latino sense, because there are like some differences. But like celebrating Mass in Spanish is beautiful. And I hadn't really been able to like do that on such a regular basis growing up.
So maybe similarly, I think to Tori, I grew up in a really suburban area of Florida where there were mostly white kids. And I think because I present as light-skinned, my last name is French, even though I'm Puerto Rican, but there's an island off the coast of Puerto Rico that was colonized by French people. So, Yusuf, you talk about the importance of knowing your history. And like, I knew that, but always having to defend that or communicate that to other people, I think growing up was a challenge, except for when I was in church. So I think part of being in going to church in a predominantly Latino church, and a Latino church that had people from all over the place. So it wasn't just predominantly Puerto Rican. So I grew up with Colombians and Salvadorans and Dominicans, and just the richness, I think, of our diversity, which was beautiful to grow up in a space where you could see just like the multicoloredness of our Latinidad. And I think for me, growing up, that was such a reflection of what Christ came to offer us, right? There's this idea in the New Testament about reconciliation between all ethnicities and all generations. And I think being able to live that out, particularly like in the context of our church family and our church community. And now, so when I moved to Boston, I was going to also a church that was very mixed in terms of just people from a lot of different countries, which was great. And I think, like I go home now and people ask me the question, like, your Spanish sounds more like Salvadoran, Colombian Spanish, because that's the people that I'm around more predominantly now. And I was a youth pastor at that church, but then I transitioned, and I'm a lead pastor at a small church now, and it's in a community that's predominantly Salvadoran. door. And so, eating pupusas on a regular basis and experiencing just the beauty of our Latinidad, right? Which I think for me has been such a grounding piece in my faith. And I think
this has always been really difficult. And it's always been a little difficult to reconcile all of my identities. This is going to sound irrelevant, but it's not. So this isn't my natural hair color, which, because people see me, they'll be like, oh, are you Irish, Scottish? I'm like, not even a little bit, not even the slightest amount. I'm naturally blonde, and so my hair is actually really dirty blonde, but when I was little, it was like white blonde. And I was the only blonde in my family. So I'm obviously like extremely fair, like green eyes, but I was like, the rest of my family are like, they're not like dark skinned, but they definitely have like darker features, like heavier features. So like my brother is like dark hair, like heavy, like Eastern European brow and like beard. So nobody gets surprised when he speaks Spanish because he looks like he could be like from Spain or something. But then I start speaking Spanish and people are like, how? But that wasn't really a problem until I moved to New York. Population. And so I wasn't completely alone, but I was definitely in the minority. And then when I went off to public school, it's kind of the opposite of some of y'all, because in Miami, it's something like a 70% Latin population, with a huge amount of that being Cubans. But then there's also a ton of like Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, Colombians, Peruvians, Puerto Ricans. Like it's just flat, like it's a little microcosm of Latin America. And so I never felt othered in that sense, because every once in a while I would go like, oh my God, you speak Spanish? I'd be like, yeah, I was in Miami. What do you think? But for the most part, everybody assumes that you speak Spanish because it's Miami. And if you don't speak Spanish, you're either like in the minority or you're up here speaking Haitian Creole. Everybody has a language. And so it's always been rough, especially like when I moved up here, it felt weird because in Miami, I was part of this Latin community by default, by being from Miami. The whole city, like that's just what it is. And then I moved up here, and I think because it's primarily, like obviously everybody from Miami is an immigrant, but that's, I feel like a lot of the times here, they're not used to somebody who looks like me and speaks Spanish like me. And so it felt like I didn't belong with mi gente anymore because I didn't look like them and I didn't grow up with them. And so it's hard having to somehow find a way to justify my ethnicity and my race and my religion, which is an ethno-religion, to people who aren't familiar with it, and somehow show people that you can be more than one thing at the same time. And it feels great when I go home to Peru, because like now it's become this like it's sort of dissociated from me being here. And I go home to Peru and I have my little baby sobrinitas who are like, queremos hacer Shabbat con la tía Bella. And I'm just like, oh, we're doing Shabbat in Spanish. Thank you so much. And like, Shabbat dinner that my tía abuela cooks with like, we have challah and then we have like seco de pollo. And I'm just like, this is the best. This is the best thing ever. Sorry, that was so long. I just have a lot of feelings.
Oh, thank you. Jordan, yes.
So I grew up in rural Ohio. Both of my parents were raised in New York. And it was really kind of an odd thing for me to grow up in this space, because it caused a lot of problems with me balancing being Latino and being Jewish, and also understanding that I was more than one thing and that was okay. Because for a long time growing up, or people saw me as being the other, and they used to come up to me and they'd be like, oh, where are you from? You look ethnic. And I was like, I don't know really what ethnic means, but it meant not from, the Midwest. And so I had a lot of like weird things happen as a result of being being ethnic, quote unquote, and nobody knowing. I've had people come up to me when I used to work at Cedar Point. For those of you who are familiar with theme parks, I had a woman from, I think she was Saudi. She came up to me and insisted that I speak Arabic to her, and told me, because she saw my name tag, and my name is Jordan, so she thought El Ordon, like, but it comes actually from the Hebrew. So she insisted that I speak to her in Arabic, and when I told her that I didn't speak Arabic, she told me, well, that's sad, because you are not paying attention to your heritage. And I said, well, I can speak Spanish to you, or I can speak mostly Spanish to you. I can speak maybe Hebrew if I try really hard and you go slow. And then she got upset. Jewish people are a culture and a religion, ethnoculture, and Puerto Rican people are a culture. And so you are both, and you shouldn't deny, that you speak Spanish. You shouldn't deny that you're Latino, and nor should you deny that you're Jewish. And so it took a long time for me to balance those, and for me to feel okay with the fact that no matter where I go, if I'm here at home in the Midwest, then I am this sort of ambiguous other. If I go, to New York, then I am, white, which is really strange to be a Spanish teacher and to be white. And to tell the kids, listen, I eat the same food as you. I do all of the same things that you do. I grew up in a Spanish-speaking home. And they're like, but mister, you're white. And then it's weird to get in a cab and have somebody speak, Moroccan Arabic to you, because all of a sudden they feel comfortable, And I think that's shaped me, because I began to look into a lot of the history, especially as a Spanish teacher and as a teacher in general. I began to look into the history of Latin American countries, Puerto Rico especially, because that's where my mother's family comes from. And I found there were Jews there. And then I found it. The older that you get, I think you become more comfortable with who you are, and sometimes you become more comfortable with standing in the middle.
So
thank you.
What I really had a burning sensation to say this. I'm so happy. It's so refreshing to come into contact with other Latinos that have the same problem as me, because we forget that physical appearance undoubtedly comes into play with your identity, which I wish it wasn't that way, but I guess as being a Mexican, I got that a lot, and ever since I was born, because I grew up in a predominantly Mexican community. Everybody looked a certain way, and then here comes this little güerita girl with colored eyes, and even when I was born, everybody would be like, "Are you sure that's your daughter? She looks kind of whitish, and she has colored eyes." And I love it. I love it so much. I'm happy to meet you all with similar problems to me, because I thought I was the only one. Everybody would be expect me to look a certain way just because I said I was Mexican. They're like, "Oh, you don't look Mexican." And I'm like, what's that supposed to mean? Because it is true. I'm the whitest of my family. My little sisters, my mom, everybody is brown. So I really would be interested into finding out as to what is in our history that would cause me to be this way, because the closest thing for my answer is my grandfather, my mother's father. He actually has colored eyes, and he's light-skinned like me. So that gives me a little bit of comfort. But yeah, it's amazing as to what you come into contact with people assuming you're a certain way. I've had people assume I'm Arab. I've had people in school think I'm Indian because they thought my hijab was a shawl. And it's really funny. It doesn't have to be negative all the time. You can take kind of a positive aspect from it. And I like being unique and different and looking a certain way. But that's the biggest, that's the funniest thing to me, that people expect you to look a certain way because you are a certain race. But yeah, I really like that, hearing from all of you your experiences with that?
I think my biggest like takeaway would probably just being just very grateful of just like being able to kind of talk about something that can be like a very touchy subject with a lot of people, and having like a fruitful conversation with so many different like backgrounds and different people. So I just think that's really, really cool. Obviously, like I have a very skewed vision of, you know, because of like where I work and like my upbringing. So I mean, like I'm, you know, 24/7 surrounded by Catholicism. So this has been really great just to kind of like break out of that and be like, hey, there are other people, and like it's really cool to just like learn and just talk about, you know, different religions, and even though we all kind of come from something similar.
Well, one of the things that I heard in all of our stories is like you can be more than one thing. Like it doesn't have to look like one thing, right? And the other piece of just like reconciling that journey in ourselves, and I think that empowers us to be able to reconcile it with one another as well, and see the beauty of it, both in ourselves and within one another. And I think like that the common thing that brings us to the table today is our Latinidad and the beautiful like mestizaje of that. And like we are a mixed people, and that's such a beautiful thing. And if I think like so often I wonder what it would look like for us to really capture the beauty of that, and how we don't all have to be the same thing. In fact, it's more beautiful and it's more rich and it's more comprehensive to see just the beautiful diversity in this little microcosm of the 6 and 7 people on this call. So yeah, I love that. Like we don't have to be one thing.
Yeah, I just super agree with all of that. And I think especially like Spanish was my first language. Like my parents only spoke, like my dad only spoke to me in Romanian. My mom only spoke to me in Spanish. And then I learned English in preschool, which wasn't hard because it's Miami, so everybody already spoke Spanish. But it's rough sometimes because people will say to me, oh my gosh, you don't look like you speak Spanish. And then I say, that's so interesting. What does a Spanish speaker look like? And it forces them to reevaluate their own preconceptions or preconceived ideas of what Latinos are, because then they realize like, oh, I was like, oh yeah, you wanted to say brown, right? Is that what you were thinking, brown? And then they look like the racist fool, because like obviously there's indigenous communities in Latin America, and obviously there's a lot of colonization, and there was a slave trade. And then in my case, it was just we needed somewhere to go 100 years ago, and that's where we ended up. But it's so beautiful to know that, because I definitely, I mean, like there's very small Jewish communities in Latin America. I'm sure that the Muslim communities are super tiny as well. But it's just nice. It feels good to know that like we have this beautiful rainbow of individuals, and like there's no two Latinos are the same, no two Latin countries are the same. Like we all have something in common, and I think that's really great. That no matter how different we are, how different we look, we have that in common while we're here in the United States, especially.
With all that said, that is all the time that we have. Thank you everyone for joining us. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on all our social media outlets and podcast platforms at Latin_entertainment, as well as our website at www.latinentertainment.org. We hope you enjoyed this season of Conversamos, and stay tuned as we have more content to send to the Latin American diaspora on Abya Yala. All here at Latin Entertainment.
Yeah, yo, is it that wrong? I'm making a song, I'm taking it back for the platform that I formed. Music's helping me transform. I run the reservoir, the predator.